we start with Justin. His work focuses primarily on the relationship between poetry, literature, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. Justin has written extensively on figures such as Freud, Lacan, but also Badiou, and more. I would single out his Infinite Thought, edited with Oliver Feltham back in 2003, specifically because I think it's one of those edited volumes which are, like a landmark. Basically, that volume, I think you'll agree, introduced Badiou's philosophy to the Anglosphere in the early O's. I would also single out Justin's monograph, Psychoanalysis is an Anti-Philosophy, but Justin is equally a truly interdisciplinary, in the real sense of the term, thinker. For instance, he has published books on romantic and post-romantic literature, but also the philosophy of education. And last but not least, he is an accomplished poet. The title of Justin's paper today is Pornosophical Philotheology, Lacan on the philosophical management of desire. Thank you, Justin. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I can't tell you, to use an Australianism, how gutted I am not to be able to be there. I managed to tune in last night for about 6 hours in a kind of sporadic fashion while feeding children and so forth, and it was already like quite an amazing experience. So that'll probably nosedive now. But let me start. In the Circe episode of Joyce's Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus is stumbling drunkenly through Nighttown with his faithless friend Vincent Lynch, expatiating upon a hoary speculative theme. So that gesture, not music, not odours, would be a universal language, the gift of tongues rendering visible not the lay sense but the first entelechy, the structural rhythm. In response to Stephen's pompous and pretentious profundities, Lynch objects that this is Pornosophical Philotheology, Metaphysics in Mecklenburg Street. Perhaps there's no better portmanteau affirmation of the rapport between pornography, philosophy, and theology. As Lacan himself notes in Seminar 5, first of all with respect to the ancient tie between prisons and brothels, and then with respect to Jean Genet's play The Balcony, in such houses of illusion, we confront figures such as the chief of police and the madame, exemplary agents, the management of desires and all their polymorphousness and perversion. Perhaps we can also speak of philosophy's world historical complicity and collusion with such management. And this paper, that was my abstract. This paper, whose matter derives from the open theme of this conference, which is, and I quote, the dialogue between philosophy and psychoanalysis, will be oriented by the Joycean passage just cited. In Nighttown, a space of licentiousness at once licensed and denied by the daylight world, ruled by the two masters who are the imperial British state and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church, obscene and impossible beings manifest alongside comically stereotypical representatives of the aforementioned law under colonial occupation. The most extraordinary transmogrifications occur. If these transmogrifications echo Stephen's earlier stream of consciousness, his raticinations on Sandemount Strand, that is, his Telemachian attempt to seize the Proteus of perception by means of Aristotelian categories at islands' territorial limits, they also seek to expose the obscene side of the philosophical enterprise, its complicity with the ghast lawyers and the British Watch and the priests and the prostitutes. But we also witness a covert deployment of a psychoanalysis which is simultaneously refused. If, during the writing of Ulysses itself, we have evidence that Joyce owned at least 2 of Freud's books and had discussions with a variety of characters about psychoanalysis, we also know from the holograph notebooks for Finnegan's Wake that he had very carefully read the case histories, which perhaps even gave him, in addition to certain ciphers, details and allusions, a central episode for the work. Certainly, Freud is also relentlessly mocked and perverted there, as is entirely appropriate for a literary anxiety of influence. Jung Freud's message bulk. Umberto Eco has given a nice decomposition of the components as Jung and Freud and Jungfrau and Freud and message and songe and mensonge. But we should also add mess, disorder, chaos, and mess, French for the Catholic Mass. Paris is worth one after all. But Jung and Freud, presented by Joyce as Tweedledum and Tweedledee, as Lacan himself strenuously underlines, are nonetheless not considered Aristotelianly, so to speak, being at least explicitly refused as means to think with or objects to think on, not even, as is done by Joyce with Aristotle, staged as covering cherubs or blocking agents for his avatars. Even fusing Jung and Freud, as Joyce does, is somewhat suspicious, given Joyce's own very mixed personal encounters with Jung himself. Regarding Jung's article about Ulysses, famously Joyce complained to the publisher Daniel Brodie, "Why is Jung so rude to me? People want to put me out of a church to which I don't belong." Brodie responded immediately, "Translate your name into German." Lacan, again, is correct here. Freud and Joyce are the same person, or at least fellow provocateurs regarding a questionable enigma of joy and signification. Yet literature, philosophy, psychoanalysis remain three quite different things for Joyce. In the prison brothel of being, not all the rabble are equal. We are, in other words, also speaking of abrasive perversions, or indeed of what Lacan will call perversion. Lest we forget, aversion is a translation prepared by a student from an older language into one's own. It also means an explication, a manner, a turning, a doubling. A perversion is therefore another version, a translation of the pair, but also a turning of or to the father. This might link perversion with another relative, the persevere, the severe father, the severed or severing father. One or severing fathers, as we might say, against Deleuze and Guattari's wolves, given that they are also always versions of severance. As the Duke says in Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, referring to his daughter's love for Valentine, despite his wish for her to marry Thurio, "Ay, and perversely she persevers so." Perversely she persevers so. This coupling of the perversion and the perseverance leads us quite naturally, that is homophonically, to their portmanteauing as perseveration, which is defined precisely as the compulsive repetition of a particular response despite the absence of any stimulus. So, perversion, persevering, perseverance. All topics self-evidently of crucial importance in psychoanalysis. Let me sketch here very minimally some of the basics of perversion in psychoanalysis, of which I'm sure all of us are already only too aware. As we know, particularly from three essays onwards, the child, maybe the species being, is characterized by their polymorphous perversity. The phrase itself, polymorphous perversity, seems on the verge of being pleonastic, even as it melds morphe and poly. Proteus, that is, to cite Homer and Joyce, and indeed someone like Charles Darwin picks up on the connection in the origin of species, Darwin writes, genera which had been called protean or polymorphic, in which the species present an inordinate amount of variation. So it's quite clear that Freud himself picks up the protean or the polymorphic in this from a primarily medical and biological background, and there it already indicates an inordinate amount of variation here to characterize the child, but also polymorphously. Perhaps the phrase is more enigmatic than we now recognize, or at least I recognize. It's not a amorphous perversity, that is simply without or other to form, but rather polymorphous. It's unclear in this formulation as to any relation between what might be potential and what might be actual, and even in the interpretations that various psychoanalysts have given of this phrase polymorphous perversity. Let's think of Lacan's own translations, even from the mirror stage essay on, into the terms of neoteny, into the underprogrammed or the undercooked aspect of the human prematurity, the specific prematurity of birth in man, as Lacan puts it, both psychically and physically. These omelettes as a heterogeneous mess of drives without any dominating predetermination, originally bisexual, and so on. Of course, as we know, this then opens the question, so how is adult sexuality possible? And not least, how is heterosexuality possible? A question that could only really be asked after Freud's work. Obviously, there's a problematic of development in Freud, the oral, anal, genital, the famous orificial developmental schemata, the images of libidinal training, temporal projections and retroactions, and so on. But adult perversity, which retains the name, of which, for instance, fetishism would be one major familiar version, is precisely not infantile, not least because of its sclerosis of form. We might even say that the polymorphous perversity of the infant has become a monomorphism, perhaps even an injective homomorphism, a function compatible with the operations of the structures, or in linguistics, a monomorphism obviously means consisting of only one morpheme. So a massive reduction. So part of the problematic of perversity in psychoanalysis, as we know, I don't think I'm saying anything either new or shocking, is that perversity is at once the ground and heterogeneous multiplicity of whatever human life is, and the child's polymorphous perversity, and whether that's better considered anarchic or polyarchic is presumably also a question here. Yet it is also precisely what is repeated and reduced in adulthood, which is no longer a ground nor a multiplicity. From a many without domination to a one in dominance, perversion would constitute, in this double sense of the word perversion, the limits of human experience. On the one side, as infant heterogeneity of obscene or overproductive variation, and on the other hand, a kind of adult monomania of the focus on the one and the only one of the fetish itself. It's presumably for reasons such as these that perversion is enjoying a particular sort of I guess there's a frenzied enthusiasm for perversion, for discussing perversion in particularly in Lacanian psychoanalysis, it seems, at the moment. For instance, the question, does perversion have a special importance in our globalized modernity, as Gérard Pommier asks. He poses this question and then says, if so, in what ways and why? His own answer is that because psychotic inventions lead to contradictions between delusions, they can never be global. Secondly, because neurotics always detour politics into direct sexual concerns regarding the other, they're incapable of organizing a properly political unity. Perversion, thirdly, however, is at once globalized through commodities that jostle against each other, but neither contradict each other nor are entirely magnetized by the sexual non-relation. In these terms, something like perversion ends up having a unifying, globalizing function, at least insofar as the splitting it entails simultaneously enables a paradoxical flexibility in plausible deniability. So the category, as I've said, it seems extremely useful in contemporary psychoanalysis and for organizing and trying to capture a number of apparently quite disparate phenomena. Here we could quote all sorts of people from Shlomo Yadlin-Godot and Yuri Hadar, who in Lacanian psychoanalysis, basically a handbook for I think practicing analysts. They'll say, alas, the paternal function is not internalized in the pervert structure, so no proper other exists in his world. I hope I didn't mishear a Lenka yesterday speaking about no proper other for AI. Maybe I've misheard that, but maybe we could also come back to that. Anyway, Godot and Hadar go on, the pervert's world is mastered by a primal father-mother, experienced as other, yet this other remains other, small o, as he himself is not subjected to the law. The pervert also is the instrument of the other, or makes themselves into the instruments of the other. And unlike the revolutionary neurotic, he acts like the meticulous administrator. We find also in Kirsten Hildgaard, Stephanie Swell, Sergio Benvenuto, of course, Slavoj Žižek, or even Dominique Hearns, who at one point suggested that, picking up on an remark of Lacan's, that while psychoanalysis has not contributed one new perversion to the world, that it nonetheless might help out psychoanalysis, that is, in encouraging some new perversions. So you can see a lot of energy and enthusiasm for this category presently. But is perversion even a sensible category, a legitimate psychoanalytic concept? Or is it itself a now toxic residue of an ancient epoch, a legacy subsisting beyond its time, a form of unacknowledged linguistic waste? Even perhaps a trace of philosophy that has continued to inscribe itself in psychoanalysis like a parasite. And to actually quote the line that Hearns, who I mentioned before, is alluding to, Lacan says, if we are following what Freud says, then we have to consider that human sexuality is perverse. He never succeeded in conceiving the sexuality in any other way than perverse. And it is at this point that I'm questioning the fruitfulness of psychoanalysis. And so we find analysts such as Danny Nobis questioning the use of perversion today. Nobis picks up four axes of criticism, those of authority, the clinical objectivities, the analyst's anxiety, and the institutional criteria of psychoanalytic training. On all of these axes, he claims the notion of perversion is false, insufficient, or indeed delusory. He notes, quote, in Freud's works, there's no such thing as a specific nosological category of sexual perversion for three reasons. Firstly, the intrinsic perversity of the drive makes every human being into a residual pervert. Secondly, starting from the assumption that the drive is intrinsically perverse, the traditional category of perversion is no longer valid. And thirdly, with the theoretical extension and normalizing of disavowal, fetishism loses its value as the distinct paradigmatic sexual economy of perversion. End of that quote. Nobis even goes so far as to suggest that perversion is not a separate structure for Lacan, but he argues for a continuity between perversion and neurosis. Whereas, but in which case neurosis is still nonetheless properly structurally founded. Perhaps surprisingly or not, Nobis's account is, in a way, a reiteration of the implications of Freud's own three essays, of which, as Arnold Davidson has noted in a famous or celebrated essay, we ought to conclude from what Freud says here that there are no true perversions. In Davidson's reconstruction, there are no true perversions precisely because the distinction Freud makes between aim and object undermines immediately every inherited moral, legal, and political justification for the term. Yet, as Davidson goes on to add, even if Freud's conclusions in effect overturn the conceptual apparatus of perversion, it is well known that he did not embrace these conclusions unambiguously or unhesitatingly. For instance, with regards to the dangers of forepleasure or foreplay, in which the normal sexual aim is endangered by the preparatory elements themselves. In other words, for Davidson, despite the radicality of the Freudian gesture, he himself is unable to fully shake his captivation by an unconscious picture of adult heterosexual reproductive sex as the de facto norm. Are Davidson and Nobis correct then, contra the other positions I've briefly invoked, in suggesting the non-coherency and the residual, i.e. the archaic irrelevance of perversion today? Well, there do seem to be a number of unintended consequences of attempts to do away with perversion in analytic therapy as well. As Avgi Sagetopoulou notes in their book on sexuality beyond consent, speaking of Joyce McDougall and Robert Stoller, in trying to avoid, quote, the pejorative connotations of perversion, immediately and helplessly even reintroduce versions such as aberration, sin, deviancy, and so on and so forth. So Sagatopoulou is therefore wants to say that, yes, there's clearly a problem with the concept of perversion or with the consistency of perversion in some senses, but the impossibility of doing without it is also a kind of non-negotiable aspect. And so we seem to be caught in this very specific, aporetic dialectic or dialectic at a standstill, I guess, of with regards to the term. Indeed, it's no doubt why someone like Patrick Vass in a classic article emphasizes that Freud fully underlines and affirms the subjective function, the properly subjective function sustained by the conscious fantasies of perversion. Here, and I'm sorry to say this, I'd like to turn to some of the work of the Slovenian school here, terrible moniker. But what I think is decisive about some of this work in this particular context is the genius for extracting fundamental analytic operations or mechanisms from exemplary cultural instances, at once purifying such presentations while offering effective and memorable images. And one of I guess very appealing operations, and sorry, I'm going to do this, and I'm also going to do this, is that there's this, in these texts and others, there's a staging of a kind of global war of psychic mechanisms which are discriminated in and by the means of staging itself. To come to speak very briefly about Zupanchik's disavowal here, short but highly clarifying. It makes a number of very important, or it underlines a number of important distinctions that I guess we're already familiar with in order to really emphasize, for instance, denial versus disavowal, reactionaries versus liberals, and so on and so on. And what it takes up is really a kind of radicalization of the famous Mannoni thesis regarding disavowal. I know very well, but all the same, this. To give one of the examples, or at least a version of the examples, a child, for instance, is told X, believes in Santa, fairies, and so on. Here we simply have the child being fed. She doesn't know anything else. Her ignorance becomes belief and a knowledge and a belief that aren't fully separated, but is being delivered by the adult. The child themselves can't know better. Secondly, in a second moment, the child realizes that this is false or a trick, that knowledge is false. The knowledge that they thought was knowledge was in fact not at all, and that authority is deceptive and deceiving. And then in a third paradoxical moment, the psychoanalytic moment, properly speaking, or the Hegelian psychoanalytic moment, I would also say, as an adult, they now believe fully in Santa and fairies or whatever, precisely because they know that it's not true. And so what we have is this kind of dialectic of belief and knowledge, which transforms from belief, knowledge, both of which is false, but is in fact an ignorance which has been inculcated as part of the mechanisms of social life. The child, in a second moment, realizes or has the revelation that this is all false, that she's been lied to, that the knowledge is false, authority is deceptive. And then thirdly, that actually makes them believe even more intensely in the fairies, or properly believe for the first time, precisely because they know it's not true. So that triplet, which I think is extremely well analysed in this book, and also has a certain kind of developmental fabular quality, is something that I want to link to some questions around the perversions, or the potential perversions of what we might call the liturgical functions of institutions in neoliberalism. After all, in many of our institutions, and not least educational institutions, on the future of our educational institutions, to invoke a Nietzschean phrase, such a practice is not only conscious, but it's also fully intersubjective insofar as it provides a socially ratified, or at least socially existent, external object practice and discourse in a hierarchy that demands certain recurrent public performances as evidence of one's belonging. As Nicholas Heron, for instance, has shown in his book on liturgical power, the Catholic liturgy itself fuses questions expressly, questions of perversion and effectivity, through its doctrines of ministry. A minister is one who self-professedly functions as an instrument, that is, at once moved by a will that is not their own, that is a tool or an instrument, but also necessarily, as a priest, as a minister, as a vicar, also as an intelligence instrument. They do it simultaneously of their own free will. So to be proper, to engage, to be a Catholic priest, you're both merely an instrument, but also you've fully chosen and intelligently become that that instrument. So, as Heron writes, a priest, for example, may baptize a woman with the sole intention of abusing her, or else he may consecrate the body of Christ only in order to use it as a poison. But since what is prior does not in any sense depend on what is subsequent, even in these limit cases in which the priest, to be sure, grievously sins, the sacrament itself retains all its validity. A perverse intention perverts the opus intendentis, but not the opus alterius. It perverts the minister's own work, but not the work of Christ, whose minister he is. Ministerial intention thus denotes something like a 0 degree of intentionality, a kind of pure intention that necessarily insists above and beyond any determinate intending, a kind of intention and nothing more. Through these accounts, then, we're able to underline that disavowal simultaneously constitutes, I think it's there in the Zupancic book, a kind of theoretical meta-discourse. Perversion is a meta-language. That is, perversion is always a phenomenon of knowing that which integrally splits its own relation to the object, but whose ever-present perversity does not undermine in the least the conforming aspects of its practice. On the contrary, the perverse power, the liturgical power affected by such instruments, constitutes a public service that literally and expressly integrates perversity into the function of hierarchy itself. If we think about, for instance, Michel de Certeau's essay, The Institution of Rot here, it's collected in English in Heterologies. Certeau adds something that is extremely important to me. Institutions, that is, or the management of institutions, that is slave management, that is the discourse not so much of the master but of the philosopher who helps out the master, that is, institutions generate authority for de Certeau precisely by structurally failing to deliver the knowledge that they promise, but simultaneously their underside, that is, the place at which the institution founds its own non-relation to its outside, must be torture. The meaning of torture is a fundamental technique at the limit of speech and bodies. And so we have the disavowal as a kind of model of let's say, administrative management, the disavowal of institutions in this particular perverse way that I'm trying to suggest, but simultaneously, in what de Certeau adds is that I guess the emphasis on this jouissance, the silent scream of the victim, that also like always sort of floods through every institution, omnipresent yet effaced. Now, as we know, and this is where I'm going to probably hurry. I think I've hopefully got a few more minutes, and I'm not overgoing my time. Is I want to return to the problem of torture in a very, very specific way. In ancient Athens, as we know, I've said this elsewhere, but I want to repeat it and try and give it a different inflection in this context with the link to the perversity of institutions. In ancient Athens, slaves could testify in a court of law only on condition that their testimony was extracted through torture. This links very quickly. I have to go too quickly here, but hopefully you'll get the point. The point is that free speech doesn't emerge as parrhesia in the sense that Michel Foucault famously elaborated, i.e. as positive, fearless public speech, but in a far more constrained and compromised fashion. In fact, speech can become free or considered to be free in the first place precisely because it has not been extorted by torture. In this mechanisms, why can the slave is not a citizen, citizens cannot be tortured, but the slave must be tortured in this fundamental democratic space. And so the slaves has no freedom of speech. So when they have to be answered a question, they can't even be able to be seen to have a choice to speak or not speak. It must be extorted. And so the idea of the impossibility of not having your speech extorted is part of this kind of limit of torture that founds the institutional base, and then it determines freedom of speech not as the freedom to say anything whatsoever. It's not parrhesia, rather it's the freedom not to have to speak, and so it's kind of a negative freedom. This is one of the kind of divisions of torture at the base of the perverse institution that I want to indicate. Now, since I'm meant to be talking, I guess I'm meant to be talking about the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis. I want to invoke Lacan's famous commentary on the Meno, where, as he says, where it's a question of the square root of 2 and it's incommensurable. There's someone who says, hey, look, get the slave to come over, that little fellow, can't you see he knows? They ask him questions, master's questions, of course, and the slave naturally answers when what the questions already dictate as their response. You find here a form of ridicule. It's a way of scoffing at the character who's being taken apart here, showing that the serious business, the aim is to make it known that the slave knows, but acknowledging it only in this derisory way, what is hidden, that is only a matter of robbing the slave of his function at the level of knowledge. It's the end of the Lacan quote. So Lacan's intervention draws out a number of aspects. First, the slave, though not being tortured, still cannot not answer his questioner. He cannot pose questions himself. His speech is therefore not free, even as it appears to be free. Second, the questions are the epitome of leading questions. The answers are implicit and so must be given as if freely. Third, what the slave actually knows, his implicit, tacit, embodied knowledge, is to be drawn out into abstract propositions by the master through this extraction tech. Fourth, this coercion, this extraction, this abstraction is a prolegomenon to these alienated knowledges being subsequently re-injected into the slave as if such knowledges had never been theirs in the first place. Knowledge depends on the slave, of course, but only ever on the master's terms. In sum, philosophy is the means, the perverse means by which the know-how of slaves is extracted through the elicitation of discourse rather than directly that of torture. Socrates' own ambivalence in this context as a figure of the philosopher is therefore partially to do with his simulation of, or even his participation in, certain features of the slave in order to transform the techniques of extraction by torture into apparently friendlier discursive extractions. As such, philosophy's covert end, but also its motivations, its justifications, its ambitions, is slave management by other means. To this extent, and perhaps not as surprisingly as all that, metaphysics on Mecklenburg Street is managerialism. Managerialism is metaphysics in the service of the master or masters, even when accosting street walkers or entering brothels. I guess that's a good place to finish. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions. I'll ask a question, giving you more time. Maybe it's actually a twofold question, Justin. I mean, one is the big topic of paraphrasing you and paraphrasing Danny, I would call globalized perversion, right? So, and I guess like the big question is both clinically, but also, anthropologically, is globalized perversion still perversion in a sense? And I think I totally agree with you that actually, in some passages, especially in Seminar 10, if I remember correctly, Lacan is very close to saying, well, there's no distinction between neurosis and perversion. But, that opens onto two different sets of ideas. I mean, on the one hand, you have the clinical pertinence of, abiding by those categories, which probably are flawed to begin with. And then you have a more sociological, instead, again, globalized dimension, whereby, if the clinical is untenable, can we still read like society through those categories? So you see where I'm going. And that was one point. And quickly, I mean, just because it echoed with some of my undergrad teaching, I mean, clearly you take like pornosophical philotheology as kind of like a critique of what you said at the end of your paper, right? A critique of philosophy somehow. But I was also wondering, like, I know you like etymologies, like pornei. I know you go back to St. Paul. For St. Paul, like, uses in Greek, like all the time, pornei, which is usually translated as immorality. But I was wondering, could we say in a way that, like literally psychoanalysis is also in a way like literally a wisdom about immorality? So you go back to perversion, like is psychoanalysis all about what I said earlier, and you said extensively, i.e. understanding whether it makes sense to speak of perversion and immorality, or whether there's a flow with the very idea of drawing a line.
Yeah, absolutely. That like great questions. The first question is exactly what's at stake in Nobis's and in Danny's point. It's like, well, as soon as it gets this globalized, it's first of all it no longer has the meaning of perversion at all, and it's actually misleading and to call it that, and you can only continue to call it that if you ignore all these other things. At that point, let's have a look at the sort of mechanisms of it. If we look at the mechanisms of it, we can see that they're kind of variations simply of repression, or not simply, but variants of repression, and therefore perversion. We should get rid of it. It's like really it's in the way. The thing that I did get interested in, though, was why does that repeat something that Freud himself intends or seems to suggest in 3 essays, as I mentioned, and also as Arnold Davidson says, has the same sort of critique of Nobis as well in this, from a Foucauldian frame in his rereading of Freud's 3 essays. And what is the problem with getting rid of perversion, or perversion, the name perversion? First of all, do you think you can just get rid of signifiers from language like that? And that's one thing. First of all, can you simply purge language like that, even from technical language? And the language of psychoanalysis is already very particular. I'm going to come back. This will lead into my answer to your second question in a moment. And moreover, as some of the other commentators point out, if you try and get rid of perversion, actually you just get the return of the repressed, precisely in the form of actually words that are even more more illusory and deceptive, like aberration, sin. Moral language returns that you are precisely trying to get rid of perversion from. So let's say there's something going on with perversion that is both at its limit and yet simply cannot be dispensed with. And so it's a sort of drive to return to that. With respect to Joyce in particular, one of the things I did want to say, and although it was just I got while writing this paper, as you could hear, it became a bit sort of, I was suturing together a whole load of things that in a way that didn't quite conform with my idealized image of what this paper would be. And what I would have done would be, in the ideal version, would have said something about Joyce. Yes, pornosophical philotheology is it also is, just by the way, it's an allusion to Giordano Bruno as well, and some other, not only St. Paul. Obviously, Joyce is compressing an incredible history into those portmanteau terms. But what I would very simply say is that Joyce's literature is directed against philosophy, even as he shows his characters, and in fact his own avatar, Stephen Dedalus, struggling with Aristotelianism, right, as the very model of philosophy, but that the struggle is to get rid of the philosophy from literature as well, or to even, in a kind of Cassanian sophistry way, undermine philosophy by placing it back into the life of the world, where it will show that philosophy is incapable of dealing with the life of the world. And its pornosophical philotheology is that a philosophy is that it's on the one hand constantly wanting to have knowledge about prostitutes, whores, and immorality, but only in the service of this kind of philotheology. Now, what Joyce is doing with psychoanalysis is something quite different. It never functions like that either in Ulysses nor Finnegan's Wake, as a target to be thought with in the same way. It's mocked, but it's also drawn on, and it's drawn on sometimes very, very covertly. He's in a different relationship with psychoanalysis than he is with philosophy, but they are both enemies to be combated by literature at its extremity. I would say that would be my thumbnail formula for for this. And in the end, the critique of philosophy is that it's perverse in the way that I wanted to suggest, and the critique of psychoanalysis in the end is that it actually doesn't go far enough. Like,
Thanks. Thank you. We have time for a couple of more questions. Comments. Alenka. Do you have the mic?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. This was great pleasure listening to you as always. Alenka here. I don't know if you see me. Hi. Yeah, no, I was really, one of the things that I really found extremely interesting is this point that you made about freedom of speech, referring to actually freedom not to speak in a way, or not being tortured to speak. It's a comment, perhaps a question, because it is nowadays, if you look whatever forms, perhaps even of perversion, whatever perverse politics that are around, one thing that I find quite striking is the way in which this freedom of speech has transformed, particularly here I'm referring to Trump, Vance, and so on, to freedom to enjoy. Which is basically, it means, it doesn't mean, okay, freedom of speech to protect yourself from whatever, to protect critical thinking, let's say, but it actually means really just not simply to say whatever you want, but even if you want to insult someone or be rude to them or use Nazi symbols, I mean, nobody should impede on your enjoyment here. So there is this kind of freedom of speech that actually invisibly almost transformed to the freedom of enjoyment, understood in that way. But then at the same time, we see this incredible rise of censorship precisely among these advocates of freedom of speech, and which is really kind of unprecedented, I would say now lately in the States. So I was just wondering if you have any, because possibly it also relates to the question of perversion, this kind of when enjoyment and speech kind of become almost indistinguishable here, and what it generates on the other side as this kind of repression and so on.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, and like I mean, the points you raise are absolutely right, and I think of Steve Bannon here as like flood the zone with shit, and so flooding the zone with shit is exactly the free speech that that these people both seem to embody and seem to be calling for. Exactly the speech without any limits at all. But that's why I cite the Bannon. They don't want this. They don't believe us. They don't actually do it. But really, it's flooding the zone with shit. Like, why? When the waste chokes the ground, no one will know where they are. And simultaneously, this will be also the pure form of hierarchy itself will be imposed through absolute forms of censorship and so on and so on. In a way, I guess what I'm saying is I'm just really reproducing and returning your question in the sense that I haven't answered it. I've just basically repeated it. But I did want to add, I think it's important to flood the zone with shit. The absolute free speech without grounds is indeed shit, right? And literal waste. We could talk about AI here a bit, which also is does it also speak? But that absolute flooding of the ground with waste will also be accompanied. I guess here I think of Freud in Totem and Taboo, where he says the lifting of a repression somewhere is made up by new repression somewhere else. And I think those two things are exactly what's at stake here as speech moves away from being free speech from the ancient model, the freedom not to have to speak. We're moving into a new zone, which is actually the impossibility of not speaking. I would say that that's one of the formulas I would have for say, the world of the internet, the rumorization, so to speak, of the internet. What is that? It's that none of our bodies, even when we wish not to speak anymore, they're giving off tons of information which is being surveilled, extracted, extorted from us, passed on through these, Latous, through the ethosphere and so forth. And so we are actually all now in a position of being de facto, I guess, tortured continuously in the sense that we are unable to not speak, if we understand speaking here in the expanded sense of just giving off or of having enormous amounts of information extracted from our bodies simultaneously by Zoom, by your employer, by your own phone, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Hello, thank you, Justin, for the great presentation. I have one question regarding the political disavowals, right? Which you referred to. My question would be: is it like a disavowal in politics? And I mean, let's say in regards to the climate change, for instance, right? Is a disavowal the end point? Because I have an impression that what you said now, I mean, that does it end here or does it go even further? So it becomes like not a disavowal of, for instance, climate change, but a foreclosure of climate change, as we can notice right now. So to eliminate the problem as such, so not even to have it. So the end point would be not to even have any knowledge about that, right? To just pretend that not even. So the end goal would be that we would not even pretend that climate change exists, right? So, so what I'm saying, that there is some sort of the logic of disavowal could be very powerful in a way, in a political sense, but I don't think it ends here.
Yes, look, that's a great point. I think, look, just sorry to invoke it again, but I think that's one of the things that's really I found extremely illuminating about the end of Alenka's book on, or towards the end of Alenka's book on disavowal, is because it really makes clear that there's a war between repression and disavowal, and they really are kind of different mechanisms in this kind of global stage of representations that is the internet, and it's genuinely irreducible, and it's also encouraging because it shows us that some of the true repressed people are the people actually denying climate change. But as Freud says, they could admit it into consciousness at the cost of putting a little knot in front of it. But actually, they are acknowledging it in a way that disavowal differently doesn't. But your point is a stronger point, which is actually if we do make perversion, as some people have suggested, into a variant, the disavowal, the operations of disavowal into a variation of neurosis, then the only other option will be the psychosis of foreclosure. Between repression and foreclosure, they will be the only two options, and that will be kind of the end game before the end game. I think there might be something in that, but I want to say something here, which I haven't said, and I probably would have preferred to be there in person to say this because it's quite hard to. It's quite hard for me to phrase it without drawing on a whiteboard, basically. But my position would be this: is that perversion isn't that I see that the terms that Lacan is using, particularly in the 50s and into the early 60s, in the sort of so-called classical period of Lacan, when he thinks about repression and foreclosure on an essentially adapted Saussurean Levi-Straussian model, what he's basically saying is this: is if you are using language like a neurotic, then the bar between the signifier and the signified, which is the no to having the meaning that nonetheless is held out as promised by the signifier, you're saying as a neurotic yes to no. As a psychotic, by saying no to that bar, which is of course the no, you're saying no to no. And so we have two positions that Lacan's taking vis-a-vis psychopathology with respect to the Saussurean the structure of the Circean sign. Do you say yes to the bar between the signifier and the signified in language? Then you're saying yes to no. And if you're not, you're a psychotic. You've said no to no. And in a way, those do exhaust the field, except for the fact that what does perversion do? Perversion wants to say yes and no to the no simultaneously. It's an operation, a kind of meta-operation on the bar. And in that sense, it does link it to psychoanalysis, which is also an operation on the, an operation on the bar of language. I would say, however, perversion is not a structure, it's an operation, a meta-operation on the bar that is an institutional one in the way that I've said, whereas psychoanalysis goes in precisely the opposite direction. It wants to say neither yes nor no to the bar of repression that constitutes signification. Sorry, this is all too rapid and quick and probably unjustifiable. But the reason I say it here is because I think, no, this means that insofar as there's this war of repression and for repression and foreclosure, there will also be supplementary operations which are non-negotiable. One of them will be the operations of perversion, quiet disavowal, and the other one will be the practice of psychoanalysis itself.
Yeah, thank you. I love the response, yeah.
You wanted to say something more? Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Justin. Thank you, Justin. It was great.